Hi, I'm Irene. And a week after I buried my husband, my own son told me I wasn't welcome at the will reading. No explanation, no apology, just silence and a locked door. But that wasn't the worst part. It was how easily they moved on, how the room I shared with Walter became a showroom, how the photos we took together vanished from the walls. And when I found my wedding bangle shoved into an envelope with the note, "No one needs this anymore," I knew. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased. But how do you erase someone who built the foundation? Would you stay quiet or would you fight back? It had been 7 days since Walter's funeral, and the house still smelled of lilies and lemon polish. Two things I'd always found more suffocating than comforting. I'd stood like a statue through the service, draped in black, while people offered half-hearted condolences and slid glances over my shoulder, like I was part of the decor, not his wife. Bryn had orchestrated everything, flowers, music, even the seating. I wasn't asked, just informed. I told myself to breathe through it, to remember that dignity sometimes looked a lot like silence. May Driscoll came by the next morning, same as she did every Saturday for the last 20 years. She brought over her usual tin of raisin scones, said something casual while pouring coffee that made the air around me tighten like a noose. "So, you going to the will reading tomorrow at Travis Place?" My smile cracked. "What will reading?" She paused, blinking. "Oh, I assumed, well, Travis said it was just family." I stood there, mug still in hand, the warmth of it suddenly foreign. I called Travis. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was. "It's a private matter, Mom," he said. "Only those named in the will are invited." I swallowed so hard, my throat clicked. "I see. That's best." Then the line went dead. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't curse. But something inside me slid sideways and settled. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the tea long cold, the silence louder than it should have been. Walter and I used to plan everything here. Grocery lists, vacation itineraries, even how to tell Travis he couldn't have a motorcycle at 16. He'd laughed when I added sticky notes to every surface. "You and your order," he'd said, smiling. When had the closeness turned into this void? Was it when Walter got sick and Travis started hovering, taking over financial meetings I used to sit in? Or was it longer ago than that? Maybe when I stepped back thinking I was giving him space, but instead gave away my place. My phone buzzed, unknown number. I almost didn't answer. The voicemail was brief, low, steady. "Irene, it's Arthur Bellamy, Walter's attorney. I regret I wasn't kept on. I just wanted you to know, I hope you're okay. And I know, maybe more than I'm supposed to, that you weren't included. If you need anything, I'm still in town." I replayed it twice. Arthur had always looked after Walter's affairs like they were his own, until one day he wasn't our lawyer anymore. Just gone. By dawn, I stood at the edge of the garden behind the house. The grass was wet, soft under my slippers. Walter used to weed that bed every Saturday. "If you don't pull it early," he'd say, "it'll choke the roots." That morning, I didn't pull a thing. I just stared past the hedges, out toward the ridgeline. The sun cracked through, gold slicing through the haze. "They've locked the front door," I whispered. I didn't say it aloud, but the next part echoed anyway, so I'll find the side one. Later that morning, I opened my wardrobe, pushed aside the muted cardigans and beige blouses. I reached for the funeral dress, black, simple, nothing fancy, pressed and hung like a relic. I laid it across the bed, smoothed it flat, not for mourning, not for memory. If they wanted to pretend I was gone, then I'd give them the ghost they thought they'd buried. The morning after that phone call with Travis, I returned to the house. Not my house, not anymore, not in the way that mattered. The brick path crunched underfoot as I walked up to the door I'd unlocked every day for over 30 years. This time, it didn't open for me. Bryn did, holding a coffee in a sleek travel mug, phone tucked beneath her chin. She didn't smile. "The guest room's ready," she said, eyes scanning past me, already walking away. Not a hello, not a sorry, just that. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, letting the silence settle. The pictures were all new. Stage photos, renovations, updated furniture I hadn't picked. My feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the master bedroom. Habit, maybe. Or memory. My hand reached for the doorknob, instinct more than thought. Locked. A small gold tag now hung beside it. Studio display room, locked. I turned and caught a glimpse of the housekeeper, Maria, someone who once asked me for Thanksgiving recipes. "What happened to our room?" I asked gently. She winced, then lowered her voice. "Mr. Henley had it cleared last week. They're using it now for guests, a showcase." My lips parted, but no sound came out. I nodded once and walked away. The guest room, my room now, was just down the hall, but it might as well have been a hotel. Clean white walls, a bed too neatly made, no photos, no books, no trace of the woman who once raised a son here. I opened the closet. My clothes weren't there, just a monogrammed robe with the estate's initials and a generic card on the nightstand. "Welcome home, T&B, Bryn and Travis." I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the card until it blurred. My hand hovered over it, but I didn't rip it. I just set it down, back where I found it. Later, I slipped into the hallway where we used to keep old drawers for miscellaneous storage. The buffet chest was still there. I used to hide letters from Walter there. His silly misspelled grocery notes, anniversary cards we'd both forgotten to sign, but kept anyway. Now it was empty. No envelopes, no cards, no us. One vase remained, blue ceramic, slightly chipped. I turned it out of habit and saw the inscription underneath, written in gold ink. W+I, 30 years, still growing. It had been turned backward, the words hidden. I carried the ache outside with me and sat on the patio. The garden bench where Walter and I once shared morning coffee was still there, though the cushions had been replaced. It looked like a stranger's yard. Bryn's voice cut through the moment like a knife as she passed behind me on her phone. "Don't sit there too long. Guests are arriving soon." She didn't wait for a reply. I stayed seated anyway, watching the wind ripple the grass where Walter used to plant tomatoes. There were no tomato plants this season, no sign they'd ever been there. But I knew. I remembered where each stalk stood. I remembered the exact curve of Walter's back when he bent to pull weeds, and the way he hummed old radio tunes while doing it. They could repaint, redecorate, rename every inch of this house, but memory doesn't need a key or permission to walk through old doors. I whispered under my breath, steady and sharp, "This house doesn't remember me anymore." But I remember everything, and memory can be sharper than revenge. By late afternoon, the main hall was filled with movement, low voices, muted laughter, the shuffling of chairs. I wasn't consulted, but I knew what was happening. Bryn called it a private memorial, as if Walter had belonged only to them in the end. The framed pictures were already being arranged along a linen-covered table near the fireplace. I walked in quietly, hoping maybe someone would notice, maybe someone would say, "Come take a look, Irene." No one did. I stood behind the folding screen, out of the way. My eyes scanned the collage of glossy prints, Walter as a young man, Walter with Travis, Walter holding the grandkids. There was one of him shaking hands with a client at a company picnic, smiling wide, shoulders proud. But nowhere in the dozens of images was I there. Not a wedding photo, not our anniversary trip to Arizona, not even the silly Christmas selfie we took 2 years ago. It was as if I had never been his wife, just someone who happened to live nearby for a while. I took a breath and waited until I caught Bryn alone in the foyer. "There must have been a mix-up," I said, my tone even. There were dozens of photos of Walter and me around the house. I know, because I hung them. She didn't flinch, just took a sip from her lemon water and said, "We only included the most relevant moments. You understand, of course." Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking like punctuation on a sentence I didn't get to finish. I stood still, my hands folded so tightly they ached. That evening, I changed into a deep navy dress and pinned my hair back. I wore Walter's watch, the one he gave me for our 30th anniversary. The living room had been converted into a small reception space, candles flickering beside white hydrangeas. My name wasn't on the seating chart, but I asked the staff where I should go. They pointed toward a folding chair, placed near the swinging kitchen door, next to a metal cart loaded with half-empty water pitchers and a mop bucket. As I sat down, a woman I didn't recognize leaned over and whispered, "Are you one of the servers? We're low on napkins over here." I nodded politely and said nothing. When the slideshow began, a hush fell over the room. The screen lit up with warm tones, and the first image appeared. Walter with Travis, Walter at the office, Walter in his favorite recliner, with a grandchild in his arms. The music, soft, sentimental, started playing. I recognized it immediately. It was our song. Walter and I had danced to it in the kitchen after his diagnosis. Slow and trembling, both of us pretending not to notice how short of breath he got. But no one in the room seemed to recall that. They smiled, some dabbed their eyes. I reached into my purse and touched the worn edge of a photograph I'd brought just in case. A candid shot, Walter laughing, his hand on my cheek, both of us flushed from the sun in the backyard hammock. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was real. I waited until the final frame faded, then rose, slowly. My heels didn't click like Bryn's. They whispered against the tile. I walked up to the small altar, framed photos, a bouquet, one of Walter's cufflinks in a velvet box. I knelt slightly and placed my photo in the far right corner, next to a flickering tea light, not front and center, just present. Bryn noticed, of course. She didn't say a word, just narrowed her eyes before turning back toward the guests. I stayed a moment longer, then whispered, "Now it's complete. I was part of his life, whether you show it or not." And I meant it, not out of anger, but out of truth. They took my seat at the table, but they can't take my place in his story. I woke before the sun, the house still thick with the scent of flowers left too long in vases. The hallway was littered with empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and the kind of silence that didn't ask to be broken. I padded quietly past the den, down toward the living room. The photo I'd placed on the altar the night before, Walter's laughing face beside mine, was gone. I found Bryn in the kitchen, still in silk pajamas, swirling almond milk into her coffee. "They removed the picture," I said. not accusing, just stating a fact. She didn't look up. Let's not cling to the past, Irene. It was just one evening. She walked out before I could say another word. Later, at breakfast, Travis sat at the island bar, scrolling his phone. Bryn leaned against the counter beside him, laughing softly at something he showed her. The two of them were synchronized now, like they'd been rehearsing this life without me for months. I stood behind them a moment too long before clearing my throat. Has the paperwork been filed for Walter's estate? Travis didn't look up. We've taken care of it. You filed it without me? You don't need to worry. I steadied my breath. I'm still his wife. Travis turned, finally meeting my eyes with a hollow stare. And I'm his son. Let us handle it. I stepped outside. The heat was rising already, baking the flagstones beneath my feet. I made it to the patio, sat down on the edge of the bench. I must have looked like a woman waiting for something, anything, but all I had was stillness. Then, a familiar voice called out, "Brought you something." May Driscoll, arms full of banana bread and wrapped in a shawl too heavy for the weather, smiled as she walked through the side gate. We chatted, weather, gardening, the oddities of losing someone you thought would always be there. She told me someone had sent a group photo after the memorial to the family text thread. You saw it, right? She asked. I didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and opened the message app. The thread was gone, not archived, not muted, deleted. I wasn't part of the family thread anymore. The banana bread sat untouched on my lap as I returned to the bench. I stared past the tree line where Walter once hung wind chimes that never stopped rattling, even when there was no breeze. I whispered, "They're rearranging a life I built, without asking, without shame." I walked inside and went to the old desk drawer in the study. It still stuck on the left, just like it always had. I wrestled it open and found Walter's planner tucked behind the usual mess of pens and takeout menus. I flipped to the last page he'd written in. It wasn't a to-do list. It was 4 words: protect what matters. He'd underlined it. By late afternoon, the sun was burning the west-facing windows. Bryn walked out, phone in hand, irritation already in her voice. Are you coming inside or just sitting out here all day? I looked at her, really looked at her. Sharp jawline, smooth voice, crisp manner, everything so tightly curated. If you insist on treating me like a guest, I said slowly, I'll act like one. I stood, brushing off my skirt. And guests, they watch, they notice things, and they remember everything. She blinked, thrown off just enough to step back. They had shut me out. Now I would start watching with both eyes open. After lunch, when the house grew quieter and the guests were gone, I slipped down into the basement. It had been months, maybe longer, since I'd stood on those creaky stairs. The air was cool and faintly metallic, with the sharp edge of old dust clinging to stone. I turned on the pull-chain light and walked toward the old shelf where I'd kept odds and ends Walter never noticed. His eyes had always skipped past clutter. There, behind a row of yellowed gardening catalogs, sat my blue recipe tin. I hadn't touched it since before his diagnosis. Gingerly, I pulled it forward. The lid stuck a little. Humidity had sealed it shut, but I pried it open with my thumbnail. Nestled between brittle newspaper clippings and index cards was an envelope, creamy, white, and thick, with a small note written in Walter's hand, confidential, for Irene only. I stood there, holding it, unsure whether to feel dread or relief. Then I opened it. Inside were documents, deed transfers, notary signatures, tax paperwork, and there, Unmistakable was Walter's signature. The estate, our land, the house, transferred to my name 3 years ago. The documents were stamped, signed, and certified by people I didn't even know had visited our home. I sat down on the basement steps and read each page slowly. Walter's handwriting scrolled in blue ink on the last sheet, just in case they forget who built this home. The words stung more than they soothed, not because I doubted his love, but because I now saw clearly how early he'd begun preparing for what came after, and how deeply he had known what Travis and Bryn might do. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of it, not fear, not sadness, something steadier, a kind of grounded fury I hadn't felt in years, not wild or reckless, focused, sharp. My mind drifted to the back porch a year earlier. It had been a mild fall day. Walter sat on the swing with a cup of sweet tea, wearing his threadbare blue cardigan. He patted the spot next to him, and I sat. "You're stronger than you think," he'd said, watching the trees. "I know what's coming. You may not want to face it, but I need to make sure you're protected if I go first." I had brushed it off, told him he'd outlive us all. He hadn't argued, just smiled at the oak leaves falling and said, "It's not about fear, it's about clarity." I went back upstairs and placed the envelope on the kitchen table. Then I reached for the landline phone, an old habit, still faster than my cell, and dialed Arthur Bellamy's number from memory. He answered on the second ring. "Irene? I found something." Within minutes, he was at my front door. I handed him the envelope and sat across from him as he carefully examined the documents. His brow furrowed, his breath catching at the last page. "This changes everything," he murmured. I shook my head. "No, it confirms everything." That night, after Arthur had gone and the house had gone still again, I carried the folder up to my room. I took the fireproof lockbox from beneath the bed, placed the papers inside, and turned the key. I slid it back under the mattress, right where Walter used to keep his retirement paperwork. I leaned back in the chair by the window and looked out at the dark lawn, the hedge now overgrown. My reflection stared back at me. Older, yes, but not weak. I whispered into the stillness. They think I have no fight left. They don't know where I've hidden my claws. And I meant it. I didn't need to scream. I just needed the right moment to show the paper. The morning sun had barely cleared the trees when I heard the knock. Not at the front door. Someone had left a padded envelope outside my bedroom. No return label, no note. I picked it up, unsure whether to be cautious or curious. Inside, wrapped in pale tissue, was my wedding bangle. A simple gold band, smooth and warm-toned, passed down from Walter's mother to me. It hadn't left my wrist in decades, until Walter passed and it had somehow vanished. I thought maybe I'd misplaced it. Now I knew better. The bangle lay quietly in my hand, as if waiting for a verdict. There was a card tucked beneath it, no signature. Just 4 words, printed cold. No one needs this anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed and held that little circle of metal like it still carried Walter's pulse. Anger wasn't hot. It was precise. It moved through me, sharpened by the insult. I dressed without speaking, without thinking. My feet led me to the old study, the one we hadn't used since Walter got sick. Dust hugged the furniture. Light filtered through drawn curtains, catching particles mid-air like tiny truths suspended between lies. I scanned the bookshelves, running my fingers across familiar spines until I reached the encyclopedias. Volume S was missing. He used it to balance the stereo years ago. Behind where it had been was a manila envelope, weathered and folded. I unfolded the papers gently, and there it was, Walter's original will, entirely in his handwriting, clear, simple. Every asset, from the house to the smallest investment, listed under one name, mine. It was dated just after his diagnosis, before Travis started attending appointments, before Bryn began handling administrative things. Walter had planned this, and now they were trying to undo him. The knot in my chest didn't unravel. It shifted, hardened. I called Arthur again. He picked up with a soft, "Irene?" "I found the will," I said. The real one, written by Walter, dated and witnessed. His voice lowered. "You know what this means." "I do. There's a more recent version on file, but this one was never legally revoked. If it holds up, it will," I cut in. "And if it doesn't, we both know who rewrote it." A beat. "This can go to court, Irene, but it'll be war." "No," I said. "It'll be a reckoning." By dinner, I had reached a quiet resolve, the kind that sat in your bones, not your voice. I chose the long table in the dining room, the one they now used only for guests and holidays. Travis and Bryn sat across from me, mid-conversation about landscaping, budgets. The children were occupied with phones, tapping away, unbothered by the woman who'd raised their father and welcomed their mother. I set the velvet pouch down on the table. "What's that?" Bryn asked, eyeing it. I pulled the bangle out and placed it between us. The gold caught the light, unbothered by the room's temperature. "If I've become so dispensable," I said, "at least return this with a little more dignity." Travis looked up sharply, his chair scraping the floor. "What are you trying to say?" Bryn shifted in her seat, the color draining from her face. "I'm not trying," I said. "I'm stating." No one moved for a while. Even the air felt still, like the room knew something had shifted. I didn't stay to explain. I stood, walked out, and climbed the stairs with slow, deliberate steps. In my bedroom, I opened the suitcase I hadn't touched since the funeral. I lifted the false bottom and placed Walter's will and the deed folder inside, locked it, sat down, listened to the house creak like it was bracing for what came next. They tore the past from my hands. Now I'm coming for the future. Let them prepare their stories. Mine was about to be told out loud. Evening came with a thickness that clung to the curtains. I was in the middle of preparing tea when I heard the knock, firm, deliberate, not the kind that belonged to a neighbor. When I opened the door, Arthur Bellamy stood there, coat slightly wrinkled, folder in hand. He didn't wait for pleasantries, just held out the folder. "Private, for your eyes only." I stepped aside to let him in. At the dining table, I opened the folder. Inside, transcripts, call records, and a signed declaration. Proof that Walter had indeed met with Arthur after his diagnosis to update the will. Arthur had documented everything, but the document submitted by Travis to the county clerk was not the same. "Travis filed a revision," Arthur said. "One I never drafted. He used a different attorney. One I've never even met." My fingers pressed into the table's edge. "Walter wanted you protected," he continued. "He didn't trust how things were unfolding near the end. I kept this in case. Well, in case it came to this." I didn't blink. "It's not fear, Arthur. It's focus now." After he left, the sky had darkened enough for the porch light to flicker on. I wasn't ready to go inside. A voice called my name softly. May. She was at the gate, holding her purse like it was full of secrets. "I was hoping to catch you," she said, eyes darting toward the house. She came closer, then leaned in. I probably shouldn't say this, but I've lived next to you long enough to know when something's wrong. Travis started showing up more often during Walter's last month. It wasn't like before. He was in and out every few days. She hesitated. It didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a negotiation. I thanked her. She touched my hand briefly, then walked off, leaving behind words heavier than silence. Back inside, I laid everything out on my bed. Walter's original will, the forged revision, the notarized property deeds, Arthur's folder, and the letter Walter left behind, the one he taped to the back of his painting. I gathered them neatly into a manila envelope and wrote one word across the front. Trice. I placed it in my handbag and zipped it shut. Downstairs, dinner was served with the same icy civility that had become routine. The kids played on their tablets. Bryn sipped wine, eyes glued to the television. Travis scrolled through his phone, only pausing to chuckle at a meme he showed her. On screen, a talk show guest was ridiculing people who obsess over paperwork from dead relatives. Bryn laughed. Imagine clinging to old paper like it's holy. Travis snorted. Sad, really. I waited until the laugh died in their throats. Paper may be old, I said, but it's powerful, especially when it's signed in love, not fear. Silence. I pushed my chair back, stood slowly, let the gravity of the moment settle. Tomorrow, I said, looking directly at both of them, the room won't laugh. They thought the fight was over. I had just begun to open the file. The courthouse air was always dry, no matter the season. I arrived at Stevenson Law Office 15 minutes early. The receptionist looked up, startled. Mrs. Gellhorn. Yes, I said, calm, dressed in Walter's favorite black wool coat. I'm here for the reading. She hesitated, then stood. Of course, right this way. The conference room smelled faintly of furniture polish and something sharp. Anxiety, maybe. Diana and Travis were already seated. Bryn sat beside them in oversized sunglasses, chewing the edge of a straw. Harold Stevenson looked up from a folder, clearly flustered. No one said a word. I took the seat opposite them and placed my handbag on the table, snapping the clasp shut. I folded my hands and waited. Harold cleared his throat. We're here today to review the most recent will and testament of Walter Gellhorn. I listened as he read. The language was clinical, the kind that made grief feel like paperwork. The terms heavily favored Travis, control of the estate, the company shares, the house. Diana didn't smile, but her chin lifted. Bryn crossed one leg over the other, smug. When Harold paused, I spoke. Are you certain that's the latest version? All eyes turned. I'd like to present something, I said, and gently slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside was everything: Walter's handwritten will, the signed deeds, notarized transfer documents, Arthur's notes. Harold opened it, hands shaking slightly. He read silently for a moment, then slowly turned to me. These are legitimate, fully executed, and older than the revision I read aloud. Bryn's heel hit the floor. Travis's mouth tightened. Diana's voice cracked the air. What are you trying to pull? I leaned back. I'm not pulling anything. Walter left this in place 3 years ago. He just never told you. Bryn whispered, That's not possible. I looked at her. Isn't it? The room quieted. I reached into my bag again and produced a small recorder. I have one more thing. I pressed play. Walter's voice filled the room, soft but firm, clear. If I'm gone, know this was my will, my final truth. Irene is the rightful owner of all I built. Don't let anyone rewrite that, not even family. No one breathed. The audio ended. The weight it left behind was heavier than any shout. I let the silence stretch, then stood, slinging my handbag over my shoulder. You removed me from the house, from the photos, from the family chat. But Walter never removed me from his heart or his plan. I turned to Harold. Please forward all further decisions through my attorney. He nodded once, eyes wide, lips pressed together. Travis didn't speak. Diana looked like she might, but no one followed me out of the room. They tried to bury me. But Walter had already planted my name into the foundation. 3 mornings had passed since the reading. I walked into Bernard's bakery the way I always had, head high, steps measured. The bell above the door gave its familiar jingle, but this time it drew a different kind of attention. The kind that comes when people aren't sure if they owe you congratulations or an apology. Bernard looked up from behind the counter, face softening. On the house, he said, handing me a warm cinnamon roll. It's the least I can do, Irene. Your husband would have been proud. I didn't need to say much. A nod was enough. The sugar glaze shimmered under the morning light as I took my seat by the window. Outside, 2 women walked past and paused. One of them said, not quite quietly, "She did it without yelling once." I didn't turn around. I just sipped my coffee. Silence had served me better than shouting ever could. Back at the house, the atmosphere had shifted. Bryn's closet was empty. The guest bedroom, where I'd once been exiled, now held boxes waiting to be picked up. Travis had stopped speaking to me, though I passed him once in the hallway. He looked right through me, not in malice, in defeat. I stood in front of the room they'd taken from me and slowly pushed the door open. It was mine again now, still, spare, but full of breath. I pulled the curtains wide. Light rushed in, spilling across the hardwood like forgiveness, or at least something close to it. That afternoon, a letter came from Harold Stevenson. I opened it by the sink, hands dry from washing a dish I didn't use. Effective immediately, it read, Mr. Travis Gellhorn has withdrawn any and all claims contesting the validity of the estate and asset transfer. I folded the letter and walked to the hallway drawer, the one that still held Walter's planner. I placed the envelope beside it. It's over, I said softly. Then I corrected myself. But it's not undone. May and I met for coffee at the cafe near the post office the next day. She wore her church hat, even though it was Tuesday. We sat in the corner booth, watching people pass by like they were part of a play neither of us had auditioned for. The town's talking, May said between sips. They don't call you the widow anymore. I raised an eyebrow. They say you're the matriarch now, that you taught everyone a lesson in how to stand your ground without making a scene. I smiled, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. They see the crown, I murmured, but they forget the ashes it came from. May patted my hand. We didn't need to say anything else. Women like us didn't rise for applause. 2 days later, I made the walk to the cemetery. The weather had turned mild, the kind of stillness that made you feel watched, not by people, but by memory. I carried a weatherproof photo frame in my handbag, wrapped in a handkerchief. Walter's headstone stood beneath the oak tree. I sat beside it and didn't speak for a long while. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out the photo. It was the one they'd erased from the memorial. The one where he had his hand on my shoulder, eyes soft with laughter. I placed it gently at the base of the stone and pressed it into the grass, anchored with stones on either side. I kept my promise, Walter, I said. I protected what mattered. Then I sat back, hands folded, and let the quiet crown rest on my head, not with pride, but with peace. Some victories wear silence better than sound, and some thrones are built in the quiet by hands that never stopped holding on. They tried to erase me, my place in the home, in the will, in the memory of the man I loved. But what they failed to understand is this: real presence doesn't vanish with silence. It grows louder, quietly, steadily, and in the end, it stands. I didn't win by shouting. I won by remembering who I was and by honoring the love that never needed an audience. If you've ever felt pushed aside, overlooked, or underestimated, let this be your reminder. Your worth isn't measured by who acknowledges it, but by how fiercely you protect it. Stand tall, even when no one claps. Walk steady, even when no one watches. And never forget, some battles are won long before the war begins, simply by refusing to forget what matters. What would you do if someone tried to write you out of your own story? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your voice. If this video touched something in you, leave a 1 in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. And if it didn't speak to you, that's okay too. Tell me why. Let's talk about it. If you want more stories that make you think, feel, and maybe even heal a little, don't forget to subscribe. I'll be here. So will the truth.